Always give offerings to your neighborhood creatures. Submitted by Writing with Blood. When we moved into that small house on Oakford Lane, I really questioned my life choices. Choices that led up to buying a house at the edge of the woods, in a town sat square in the middle of nowhere that is the Midwestern US. Rent was cheap, though, or as cheap as you can get in Indiana, so it just sort of worked with the circumstances at hand. As you guys know, jobs are hard to get right now, and with mine on the line, John and I had to settle for what we could find. It didn't really look like the type of house you'd see in the middle of a dense grove. It was modernized, with an open living plan and a renovated bedroom upstairs. Incredibly nice for $800 a month. Still, sitting in the car with my cheek pressed against the cold window, I watched the trees pass by us with a certain disdain. I'd always lived in the city, and I wasn't that happy with that changing anytime soon. John found the listing and insisted though. Like always, John gets what he wants. I love him to bits, and at the end of the day, I'd probably sacrifice an arm and a leg for that man. God only knows, he keeps my head on my shoulders. "Aren't you excited?" he had asked me, grinning at me from the driver's seat. The sun beamed in through his window, almost blinding me, his silhouette being the most identifiable feature at the time. I could just barely make out his smile. "How did you find the listing again?" I asked absently, deflecting the question. I didn't want to burst his bubble with a feeling deep in my gut. "Oh, just Facebook Marketplace. I told you that yesterday." "Right." I exhaled, sitting upright once more, a kink in my back denying me the pleasure of exhibiting how I felt with posture alone. How inconvenient. "Oh, we're here." He laughed a bit, and I watched the passing scenery slow to a stop outside of the car. The house just looked like your average house. I don't know. I didn't really notice anything off about it, except for the location it was in. Those trees were another story altogether, though. They loomed in the background, pressing in on all sides, creating the impression that any day they could swallow the house whole. A reclamation of nature, if you would. "We're pretty far out from everything." I trailed off, opening the passenger side door and stepping out. Maybe it wasn't too late to cancel the lease. Find a nice studio somewhere downtown, maybe. Nah, we'll be fine. That's what cell phones are for. John stepped out of the car, locking it behind us. He led the way up to the house, and I trailed behind. Always one step behind him. I know how that sounds, I really do. But it's just the way things have always been. The rest of the day was an uneventful flurry of moving boxes to different rooms. I asked him why he hadn't labeled them, but he just shrugged. He deemed it unimportant, he said. It was very important, I countered. Now we didn't know what boxes went in which rooms. He brushed it off though, the same way he did most of my concerns. With the argument that I was overreacting once more. So I shut my mouth, went through box by box, and put them in their respective rooms. The night was a different story. When dark fell, so too did the shadows of the trees beyond the house. It felt as though something could come out from the dark at any time. That I'd be in the kitchen, and the second I turned around, I'd see it at the glass patio door. Just standing there. How right I was. The first night went fine, though. We found a couple dead animals in the backyard, all of which John chalked up to as coyotes. I wasn't so sure. But what would I know? I was from the city. John wasn't. He was familiar with these parts, he told me, when we were looking at the house. He'd lived just down the block as a boy. I guess I can understand the nostalgia, but I didn't have that appeal. That sort of attachment he had. He was reassuring, though. Always ever so comforting. It wasn't until a weekend that things changed. John started spending most of his time fishing in a lake he said was nearby. Just past the tree line. He begged me to come with him every morning around 8 a.m. But each day, I refused. It became routine, after a while. My loving John just wanting to spend quality time with me, and me being too chicken shit to even step out of the patio door. It felt as though, if I went outside, I would get sucked into the forest. The same way it threatened to overtake the house, so too would it overtake me if I did. The days passed by, and John grew frustrated with my resistance towards the outside world. It got to the point that I started calling off work, neglecting to leave the house altogether. What if I got lost on my way out of the winding neighborhood? Or if I drove off into the creek we passed on the way here? These fears swirled around in my head, and despite how irrational I knew they were, I couldn't help but fall to the mercy of my own anxiety. I found myself staying in bed most of the way with the curtains drawn tightly shut, blocking out the outside world. It was a month in that I saw it for the first time. A blur next to the car as John and I drove to the grocery store, something tall and gray, moving through the trees. "John, there's something out there," I'd shouted instinctively, jerking my head towards the window. "Probably a wolf. They're common around these parts," he'd reassured me with a chuckle, his hands tight on the wheel of a car. "No, it was big, it wasn't," I trailed off, unsure how to explain what I'd just seen. "Just a blur. Wolves are big, you know, Sam. They're massive. I'm sure that's what you saw." He smiled at me, ever so patient. I was sure he was wrong, though. I would see it closer to the house each time we left, approaching almost cautiously despite its inhuman speed through the forested grove. It felt like something was approaching rapidly. My fears came true one night in January. It had snowed, and I felt peaceful for the first time since we'd moved in. Christmas had just passed, and seeing the family once more had really helped me combat my own fears. Their reassurances had warmed my home better than our fireplace ever could have. That night, I'd gone to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. My sleeping medicine made my mouth feel like it was stuffed with cotton balls, and John had taken my water glass to the kitchen. "You have to wash it sometimes," he'd said in disgust. I suppose he was right, though I was still irritated as I walked down the cold wooden stairs at 1 in the morning. The floor was ice to the touch with the fireplace off. I ran the tap, grabbing a glass from the cabinet next to the sink, and filled it as quickly as possibly. My heart hammered in my chest as the patio door loomed behind me. It felt as though every second was precious. That night, I saw it. Looming in the window, as tall as the 9-foot ceilings. Long, gray, spindly, and barely humanoid, it stood there. Gaping holes where eyes once may have sat. It watched me, and I watched it. My glass dropped to the floor, shattering, and it sped off at a speed I could hardly comprehend. It didn't matter what I told John. He didn't believe me. Made me commit to seeing a therapist once a week as soon as morning came. But I knew what I'd saw. And I knew he knew, too. I'd seen the photos of effigies he'd hidden away, stowed in a shoebox in the very back of his closet. It demanded offerings. It spoke to me one night, tapping on the window. Its raspy voice chilled me to my core. Offerings. And so I started putting them out. Just small things at first, a bit of a cake I had made, or a painting I had crafted. It was enough for a while. Until it wasn't. John's invites to the lake became almost urgent, and still the creature stalked closer to the house, knocking on the windows to demand more. I would pretend to lay asleep as John begged at the window, asking for more time. I knew what he meant to offer. So I did it first. I called his work, and told them he quit effective immediately. I called the police, and reported him as missing. I said he'd gone to the bar, and hadn't come home in over a day and a half. For the first time since I moved in, I stepped out on the patio, and bleached it. Mopping up blood off of cement the second the creature had finished its work, doing my best to keep it from staining. And the next morning, outside on my patio door, sat a small kitten, mewling and hungry. An offering, to replace what I had lost. To warm the newfound cold emptiness besides me in bed each night. For me. I took the kitten in, naming him Luke. The creature and I developed a friendship. Once every 25 years, we agreed. I hope to be gone by the time the debt comes to pay, but for now, we stand at an impasse. All I know is that the one-time robbers attempted to enter my home, the only thing remaining was a dead carcass in the entrance to the forest of trees. I left it to the creature. I don't belong in the forest. No one does. It's home to things we can't possibly understand. I think that's why it chose me instead of John. I respected that boundary. Never go into the forest outside of your house. But always give offerings to your neighborhood creatures.